During the Little Ice Age, cold did not remain outside medieval castle walls. It seeped inward and settled there. Winters stretched longer, summers lost their strength, and thick stone that once buffered discomfort began storing chill instead of warmth. Fires burned continuously, yet heat faded almost immediately. Castles built to withstand armies slowly transformed into cold reservoirs, reshaping daily life into a quiet, persistent struggle against the environment itself. The Little Ice Age was not a single catastrophic winter, but a slow environmental shift that unfolded across centuries. Average temperatures declined gradually, often by just 1 or 2 degrees, yet the impact was profound. Winters became longer, arriving earlier and releasing their grip later in the year. Summers, once capable of warming stone walls and drying interior spaces, grew shorter and weaker, rarely penetrating deep into castle interiors. As a result, cold was never fully reset by the seasons. Stone castles absorbed this imbalance year after year. Thick walls that had once moderated temperature now stored lingering cold from extended winters. Each generation inherited buildings already chilled by decades of inadequate summer warmth. Unlike wooden homes, stone structures responded slowly to change. They retained whatever conditions dominated longest, and during the Little Ice Age, that condition was cold. This meant daily life unfolded in an environment that felt perpetually behind the season. Even during spring or early summer, interiors remained cold to the touch. Floors, walls, and staircases radiated chill long after the snow had melted outside. Over time, cold stopped being a seasonal challenge and became a constant architectural presence. I can sense how exhausting this must have felt. Not a single brutal winter to endure and recover from, but generations living with cold that never truly left. The absence of relief may have been harder than the cold itself. Medieval castles were never intended to provide comfort. Their design priorities were defense, visibility, and durability against attack. Thick stone walls resisted siege weapons, but also blocked sunlight and absorbed cold. Windows were narrow and few, limiting both light and passive heat. High ceilings, meant to disperse smoke and intimidate visitors, allowed warm air to rise far above where people lived and worked. Corridors were long and narrow, designed for control and defense rather than insulation. Airflow moved freely through stairwells, arrow slits, and open halls, creating constant drafts. Doors and shutters, often made of wood without proper sealing, warped over time, worsening heat loss. Even when fireplaces burned steadily, warmth remained localized, rarely spreading beyond a few steps from the hearth. During earlier medieval climates, these flaws were tolerable. But as temperatures declined, the mismatch between architecture and environment became unavoidable. Castles did not adapt quickly. Rebuilding or redesigning stone structures was costly and slow, leaving inhabitants to cope with spaces increasingly hostile to human comfort. As the Little Ice Age deepened, castles revealed their true nature. Not as homes, but as fortresses ill-suited to prolonged cold, forcing their occupants to adapt their bodies and routines instead. As temperatures declined during the Little Ice Age, moisture became an invisible but constant enemy inside medieval castles. Colder air held less warmth yet often carried higher humidity, especially in regions with frequent rain, snow, or fog. Stone structures absorbed this moisture easily. Walls, floors, and staircases slowly drank in dampness, turning castles into cold, wet shells rather than dry refuges. Unlike wood, stone does not dry quickly. Once moisture entered the walls, it lingered for months, sometimes years. Damp stone felt colder to the touch and drew heat away from the human body more efficiently. Even when fires burned, warmth struggled to counteract the chilling effect of moisture trapped in masonry. The air inside castles often felt heavy and raw, intensifying discomfort beyond what temperature alone could explain. Humidity also worsened living conditions in less obvious ways. Bedding, clothing, and stored food absorbed dampness, making them heavier, colder, and slower to dry. Mold and decay became common, contributing to illness and further eroding comfort. Cold and moisture reinforced one another, creating an environment where warmth was fragile and temporary. Over time, castle inhabitants learned that dryness mattered as much as heat. Yet with limited ventilation control and constant exposure to the elements, true dryness was nearly impossible to maintain. The result was a cold that penetrated not only the walls but the body itself. Fire was the primary source of heat in medieval castles, but during the Little Ice Age, it proved increasingly inadequate. Fireplaces were designed to warm small areas directly in front of the hearth, not entire halls or multi-level spaces. Heat rose quickly, escaping through high ceilings, stairwells and open roofs, while cold air pooled where people lived and slept. Large rooms diluted warmth almost instantly. Even when multiple fires burned, their combined heat struggled against the mass of cold stone surrounding them. Chimneys carried away much of the heat along with smoke, and fuel supplies, wood, peat or charcoal, were finite. Maintaining constant fires required enormous labour, and in harsher winters, fuel simply ran out. The rhythm of daily life revolved around fire. People moved closer, worked closer, and slept closer to the hearth, knowing warmth would vanish the moment they stepped away. Fires were not a solution, but a fragile defence against cold that never truly retreated. I imagine the frustration of tending a fire all day, only to feel the cold return the moment you stepped beyond its reach. The effort never matched the reward, yet stopping was not an option. Wind became one of the most relentless forces shaping life inside medieval castles during the Little Ice Age. Castle layouts unintentionally amplified its effects. Long corridors, narrow stairwells, and open vertical shafts acted like funnels, pulling cold air deep into the structure. Even a mild wind outside could transform interior spaces into channels of constant drafts. Sealing methods were crude, doors and shutters were made of thick wood, but without modern insulation, gaps formed easily as materials aged, warped, or shrank in cold weather. Arrow slits, ventilation openings, and imperfect stone joints allowed wind to slip through unnoticed, yet persistent. Over time, these drafts erased much of the warmth produced by fireplaces, replacing it with moving cold that felt sharper and more invasive than still air. Wind did more than lower temperature, it exhausted the body. Continuous exposure forced inhabitants to remain in motion, layering clothing and adjusting positions to avoid direct drafts. Stillness became uncomfortable. Even well-lit rooms felt hostile when air moved constantly across skin and clothing. In winter, wind turned castles into places where cold was never static, always shifting, always finding new paths inward. As winters intensified, people learned to identify cold corridors and avoid them when possible, yet total escape was impossible. Wind threaded through the architecture itself, making the castle not just cold but restless. As cold tightened its grip on castle interiors, daily life began to contract. Large sections of castles were simply abandoned during winter months. Rooms that were tolerable in summer became unusable in colder seasons, their size and exposure making them impossible to warm. Life withdrew toward hearths, kitchens, and smaller chambers where limited heat could be conserved. Social interaction adapted to this compression. People gathered closely, sharing space not for intimacy, but necessity. Movement replaced comfort as a survival strategy. Walking, working, and performing tasks kept blood flowing, when sitting still became painful. Rest was shortened, and sleep was fragmented, often taken in shifts near sources of warmth. Work schedules shifted with temperature rather than daylight. Tasks were planned around warm zones, and routines became simpler, more repetitive. The cold dictated not only where people lived, but how they lived. Privacy diminished as shared space became essential to survival. Over time, this narrowing of daily life reshaped habits and expectations. Comfort was no longer anticipated. Instead, endurance became the measure of a good day, whether the cold had been managed rather than defeated. The castle ceased to feel like a grand residence and became a series of survivable pockets carved out of an otherwise hostile structure. As the cold became permanent rather than seasonal, adaptation shifted from architecture to the human body. Clothing evolved into the first and most reliable layer of insulation. Multiple layers were worn indoors as well as outside, often without removal throughout the day. Wool became essential, not for comfort, but for survival, as it retained warmth even when damp. Fur linings, heavy cloaks, and thick stockings were used wherever resources allowed. Daily habits adjusted alongside dress. People slept fully clothed, sometimes wrapped in cloaks or additional blankets. Shared sleeping arrangements became common, as bodies conserved heat more effectively together than alone. Beds were moved closer to walls that received marginal warmth, or nearer to hearths when possible. Morning routines slowed, as leaving the warmth of sleep required effort and resolve. Personal hygiene routines were also influenced. Washing with cold water was avoided in winter, and activities requiring exposure were minimized. Movements became deliberate, conserving energy and warmth. Over time, these practices felt normal rather than extreme. Cold shaped behavior quietly, embedding itself into routine. Adaptation did not remove discomfort, but it reduced risk. Clothing and habit formed a mobile shelter, one that moved with the body when the building itself could not be trusted to protect it. The cold of the Little Ice Age did more than alter comfort. It restructured life inside the castle. Access to warmth followed social hierarchy. Nobles occupied chambers closer to hearths or with better insulation, while servants worked and slept in colder, more exposed areas. Heat became a resource, unevenly distributed and carefully guarded. Children adapted fastest. Growing up in cold spaces, they learned early how to layer clothing, seek warm zones and remain active. For them, cold was not an exception but a baseline condition. Adults, especially newcomers or visitors, often struggled more, their bodies unaccustomed to constant exposure. Over time, cold lost its urgency. It was no longer treated as a crisis, but as an assumed feature of life. Complaints faded. Not because conditions improved, but because endurance became normalized. The castle's social rhythms adjusted accordingly, shaped as much by temperature as by tradition. I feel that over time, cold stopped being an emergency and became a background condition, something people no longer questioned, only endured. This quiet acceptance may have been the most powerful adaptation of all. Living for extended periods in cold, damp castle interiors placed immense strain on the human body. Respiratory illnesses became more common as cold air irritated lungs and weakened resistance to infection. Coughs lingered, fevers returned repeatedly, and recovery slowed during winter months when warmth and nutrition were harder to maintain. For many, illness was not a sudden event but a prolonged condition that ebbed and flowed with the seasons. Dampness intensified these effects. Cold, moist air penetrated clothing and bedding, keeping bodies in a constant state of heat loss. Joints stiffened, circulation weakened, and fatigue accumulated. Wounds healed slowly in low temperatures, increasing the risk of infection. For the elderly and very young, the castle's environment could be especially dangerous, turning minor ailments into life-threatening conditions. Medical knowledge offered limited relief. Treatments focused on balancing bodily humours, but the environment continually undermined these efforts. Without consistent warmth, even foreign rest failed to restore strength fully. Survival depended less on curing illness and more on enduring it. Health in medieval castles during the Little Ice Age was therefore fragile. Cold did not always kill directly, but it wore people down gradually, reducing resilience and narrowing the margin between survival and collapse. The Little Ice Age exposed the hidden vulnerabilities of medieval castles. Structures built for war proved poorly suited to prolonged environmental stress. Thick stone walls trapped cold instead of resisting it, while large spaces diluted every attempt at warmth. Architecture, once a symbol of power and protection, became a source of daily hardship. Life inside these castles adjusted accordingly. Comfort was no longer expected. Endurance replaced ease, and routine replaced relief. People adapted not by changing their environment, but by changing themselves, through habit, clothing, movement, and acceptance. Cold became woven into identity rather than treated as a temporary obstacle. The lesson is quiet but enduring. Human survival often depends less on perfect design than on flexibility. When structures fail to protect us, resilience emerges through adaptation rather than resistance. Medieval castles during the Little Ice Age remind us that hardship does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it settles in slowly, shaping lives through persistence rather than force.